10 years ago, rain wrote a secret onto the windshield, and everything that mattered slid away. Ksenia remembered the sound first, the brittle roar of water, the way a headlamp became a thin, jagged line before it folded into night. She remembered a name she had never meant to hear again. Glafira. The memory arrived without warning now, a loop that cracked across her mornings like cheap china. Even from the other side of the nursery door, she could feel its weight, the residue of a life that had narrowed to a single promise. She would never leave the child she had taken into her hands the night the world closed. In the present, the house gave the impression of order. Polished wood, rugs pressed flat by invisible footsteps, silver left to shine in soft circles beneath the afternoon light. The household ran as though on a metronome. Meals, lessons, the child's therapy appointments, the quiet ritual of wiping the rims of teacups until they gleamed. Ksenia moved within that rhythm with the ease of someone who had learned to make her body small and careful so she would not bruise anything else. Glafira's room smelled of chamomile and starch. A mobile with paper birds circled above a small bed. Drawings were taped to the closet door. Houses with crooked chimneys, stick figures with oversized eyes, a sun that always forgot to shine. 2 figures were missing from most of them. The little girl's pencil hovered where faces should be. Instead, empty circles indicated absence with the bluntness of a child's honesty. Ksenia knelt on the rug, fingers brushing a stray lock of hair away from her small forehead. Glafira's lashes were too long for her features, and when she looked up, the world shifted in a way that still startled Ksenia, a trust that felt both sanctifying and terrible. "Do you want a story?" Ksenia asked. The question was not only for the child, it was to steady herself. Glafira's veined hand found Ksenia's, small and certain. "The tree story," she said, in a voice that had learned to be small when the world hurt. So Ksenia told a story about a tree that refused to forget how to grow. She made its roots stubborn, made its branches impatient, and in the pauses she watched the child breathe, the rise and fall, a private liturgy. The house beyond Glafira's door continued its quiet business. Pavel's car in its place by the gate, the soft clack of a servant's heels in the corridor, a kettle hissing with the patience of something always on call. Pavel sat at his desk in the study, like a man keeping vigil over numbers and obligations. He kept the grief he bore with tight, efficient gestures, gestures that became mistaken for indifference. The portrait of a man who calculated distance as protection was convenient to the world, but it obscured the rest. A private tenderness that came out in cracks when he lingered too long by the nursery door, or when the ledger lay open and his hand hovered over Glafira's name longer than over any business code. Ksenia understood his distance as if she had measured it herself. She had lived enough years on the edge of someone else's danger to know that people sometimes raised walls out of fear rather than cruelty. She watched him in the quiet, sometimes thinking she could map his grief as easily as the old bruise beneath her own ribs. She had sworn never to be a problem. She had promised the child the things promise can still cover. Outside, Gina's little restaurant kept its tired neon sign blinking in the rain. He was a permanent fixture of the street, thick-shouldered and laugh-prone, a man who had been kind long before kindness asked anything of him. He brought breakfast, sour cherry jam and bread, wrapped in foil, and the clumsy tenderness of someone who believed steady devotion could fix what fate had broken. He loved Ksenia in a way that wanted to repair the world with small, practical offerings, loans at the end of the month, the occasional bread left at the back door, the kind of admiration that refused to read the fine print of class or circumstance. Kira, by contrast, loved possibility with a different appetite. She belonged to the family the way a vine takes a trellis. She climbed when it suited her, and shaded others when she needed to. Her eyes had the habit of measuring, They found advantage in places other people passed by. She wore her ambitions like jewelry, discreet, well-polished, and meant to be noticed. When she smiled at Ksenia, the smile never settled fully in the face of the woman she regarded as an instrument. "She is so devoted," Kira would say, and the words would land like coins placed just far enough away to be unreachable. But devotion does not pay the bills. Ksenia moved between them, the steady, the calculating, the remote, with the practiced flexibility of someone who had learned to make herself useful, enough to be necessary, yet invisible enough not to attract attention. Her life was a ledger of small sacrifices. She paid the school fees and smoothed the child's nightmares. She kept her own grief in a closet, an old wardrobe in the attic, its door always latched. Inside, there were things she never let light touch: a yellowed driving license, a photograph of 2 smiling faces that meant everything, a scarf that smelled faintly of petrol and rain. The wardrobe had become a passage for memory. She would open it sometimes at night and press her forehead against the wood, letting the past hum against her like a quiet engine. The first small crisis came not with thunder, but with a small, insistent knock. Mikhail stood on the back stoop with an ankle still raw from running and a desperate kind of roundness in his eyes. He was Ksenia's brother, young, impulsive, a man who felt the world like a challenge rather than a burden, and he had debts that did not care for the dignity of apologies. He had been working nights at Gina's restaurant, but nights there did not make up for the kind of money he had promised some men in an orange-lit room. "I can fix it," he told her, voice quick and full of solutions that were as thin as paper. "I just need a bit. Then I get the contract. Then—" "How much?" Ksenia asked, because she lived by the small arithmetic of needs. Her hands had known only 2 currencies, what she could give away and what she could not. "You said you'd ask Gina." "I did," he said, and in that answer was a kind of defeat. "It isn't enough, not this time." Ksenia had money enough to cover small things. She had saved from years of loyalty in a house that paid well for silence and stamina. But money meant choices inside the household. It meant loans called in the place of compassion, or more dangerously, it meant a ledger line that could be misread by eyes that preferred a story of betrayal to the complexity of a desperate man. She promised Mikhail she would ask around. She promised him the thing she had been promising other people for years: time. Days slipped into a pattern of worry. Ksenia taped Glafira's drawings with extra care. Pavel instructed a tutor to spend more time on mathematics and less on the arts. The tutor's arrival unsettled the child's small world. Gina brought sweet bread with extra care and watched Ksenia like he was cataloging her small mercies. Kira watched the watchers and sharpened her plans into actions. The seed of something forbidden sprouted in the quiet between a storm and a child's cry. It was after midnight, and the house had folded into itself. Glafira had woken with the kind of terror that held a child's limbs rigid and eyes wide like fish pulled from water. Ksenia had carried her small body into the study, where the fire still breathed red, and there, for the first time in months, Pavel sat without the protective armor of distance. His suit was off, and his tie hung loose, and the lines of his face were revealed in a way that made him look both older and more fragile. "She said she was in the car," Glafira whispered to the night, words reaching like thin strings. She repeated the name of the dead as if saying it aloud could anchor something that had been shaken loose. Ksenia felt the floor fall away when Glafira brought up that night. She tucked the child's knees close and began the steady motion of humming. Pavel stood by the window and watched the rain make a smear of light on the glass. He had not come to comfort. He had come because of the noise of it all, because the house could no longer pretend the child's nightmares were someone else's problem. "She woke again," Ksenia said, because someone had to put words around the fear. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the tremor of the child's small shoulders. Pavel's voice was not a flat instrument tonight. There was an abrasion to it, the kind that comes when grief has run out of polite expression. She needs certainty, he said. She needs to know where she belongs. Ksenia thought of the closet in the attic and the promise she had made to a grave. She thought of how belonging had become both anchor and chain. She belongs where she feels safe, she said. Her hands tightened around Glafira's one remaining wrist. She belongs with people who keep her safe. Their eyes met then, in the way two people who had been living parallel griefs might. It was a small collision, almost invisible, but it altered the light between them. For the first time, the man who measured life by obligations looked like someone who could be hurt. For the first time, the woman who had sworn to make herself small for the child's protection sensed the possibility that she could be seen by another human being without him shrinking the weight of what she carried. It was an intimacy born of exhaustion. There was no whisper of seduction, no calculated step toward illicitness. It was the sharing of a moment so raw that it could not be contained in the roles they occupied. Pavel brushed a stray lock of hair from Glafira's temple, as though the gesture itself might stitch time back into its proper place. His fingers trembled. Ksenia's throat tightened. Her heartbeat made a hard sound in her ears. A hand on a child's shoulder would be dismissed by the world as simple kindness, an act of a father. When it happened, the house clerk, who had the habit of noticing little things, called it a moment. But moments became tracks. Tracks became choices. Kira watched that exchange through a parlor window as if it were a chessboard piece moving into place. She catalogued the softness between Ksenia and Pavel like a banker catalogued assets. Later, she would turn that soft footage into profit, because of course, she had planned for this. She always planned for anything that could shift the household's balance. Her plan began with small things: a misplaced scarf, a rumored missing silver spoon. Kira cultivated small resentments among the staff, like a gardener who tended to weeds until the bed was full. She made sure the gossip hours in the servants' kitchen skewed in her favor. She overheard conversations and misunderstood them on purpose. She turned off lights and then claimed that someone else had been careless. The household, like any closed ecosystem, began to show its rot. The accusation itself was ridiculous in its simplicity. A pendant, small and old-fashioned, had vanished from the drawer where Pavel kept gifts for a deceased wife. It was the sort of object that belonged to memory more than to economy. Kira told a story. She'd seen Ksenia in the corridor with something wrapped in a handkerchief the other day. Who else would have access? Who else might want the trinket? It was a neat little sequence that required only one more element: witnesses whose testimony could be persuaded by the right kind of insinuation. But Kira moved with patience. First, she made a show of concern for Pavel. Such a good sister-in-law to worry, to console, to ensure the affairs of the house remained respectable. Then she arranged for the pendant to turn up in a place where logic would pin it on an unremarkable scapegoat. The pendant was found in the nursery closet. Armario, the closet, was a recurring ghost in Ksenia's life. Every time she opened that door to tuck away fresh sheets or reach for a child's winter boot, the past hummed against the wood. Finding the pendant, there was a small violence. It suggested a breach, a betrayal as intimate as it was public. "They say they saw you coming and going," Kira mentioned casually to Pavel at dinner, the sentence thrown into the air like a pebble. Not that anyone would think, "Oh, I don't know." Pavel's eyes went hard. "Who?" he asked. Because when a household is small and rituals dictate order, a breach feels like contagion. Ksenia had been in the nursery all morning, rocking Glafira and sorting through the child's drawings. The pendant had been hidden in a corner behind some chalk and a threadbare stuffed rabbit. When Pavel confronted her that afternoon, He did it with the absence of an executioner and the bewilderment of a judge. "It was in the closet," he said. His voice, which had held itself like a ledger, lost a register. "How did it get there, Ksenia?" The accusation landed like a hand across her mouth. She had never in her life taken anything from that house except the memory of a promise. She had kept accounts of kindness in a personal ledger that no one else could read. She had learned to make herself indispensable. But innocence, in the face of orchestrated suspicion, had the precariousness of lace, beautiful, fragile, and easily torn. Ksenia's answer was simple. She had no idea. She offered her hands, the hands that had ironed sheets and read the same story 100 times. She showed Pavel the faint scars at her wrists from where the seatbelt had bitten on a night long ago. She pointed to the old wardrobe in the attic if someone would look. The evidence of her past was there, brittle and honest. Pavel walked the house in a loop from nursery to study, as if there were a map somewhere that would make sense of the chain of custody. The staff gathered in small clusters, eyes averted or sharp. Gossip is a living thing. Once fed, it demanded more. Kira glided through the crowd like a solutionist, her hands busy filling the space with suggestions. "Maybe she needed the pendant to sell," another voice suggested. The words were not cruel, they were plausible. The household had always hungered for drama, as if it needed the company of scandal to feel alive. Ksenia refused to bow. When Pavel's silence became a weight, she pressed her palms together in a way that once would have been habit and now felt like penitence. "Search me," she said. "Search the nursery. Search my room. If someone thinks I would steal from this family, let the truth be found." Pavel's eyes were not unkind. There was a man who saw an unmanageable tangle of possibilities and could not find a lever. The accusation, even if misplaced, would need to be settled in a way that did not harm the child. That thought, Glafira in the crossfire, was the fulcrum that made decisions ring hollow. He had to be fair. He had to be decisive. By the time the watchers had moved and the house quieted, a decision had been reached not with a courtroom's rigor, but with a family's expediency. Ksenia would be asked to step aside during the investigation. She would be fitted into a day room where she could not be near the child while the matter was looked into. It was a compromise that pretended to protect the innocent. Instead, it isolated the loyal and left her to the private calculus of shame. In the days that followed, the workload of a house doubled when trust left. Ksenia found herself in the margins, the place where the family affections used to be counted. Glafira's questions became small, urgent shafts of need. "Why did you go away?" she would ask, and when Ksenia knelt to answer, the child's eyes would search for the face she had been promised would never go. What Kira had not anticipated, and what would become the less controllable element of her plan, was the way the child reacted. Glafira's attachment did not understand verdicts. She clung fiercely. She refused to accept the distance as a fact of life. If anything, the accusation made the child's love purer and, to the adults watching, more dangerous. Pavel watched this with his hands folded, torn between two kinds of duty. He had to show the household that justice was not flexible. Yet he had a child's arms wrapped around the only woman who knew how to hold the small fragments of his daughter's days together. In the privacy of his study, he replayed footage from the nursery camera that always pointed like a watchful eye. The camera was simple, meant to monitor, not to interpret. Kira had relied on its existence. The camera would present an image, and the image could be tumbled into a story. The footage, when Pavel reviewed it, was ambiguous. Ksenia was in the frames, as she had always been, tucking in a child, picking up toys, blocking an invitation to a meltdown, with the kind of small physicalities that did not translate into guilt. Yet in a solitary frame, Ksenia's hand brushed something in the corner of the closet that might have been the pendant. Had she been the one to reach for it? The angle made it unclear. The camera could be a witness and a liar with the same breath. Kira brought the pendant to a brunch with Sophia, the grandmother whose opinion had become the household's last seal of approval. Sophia arranged her pearls and listened with an exacting calm. She had the power to tilt a house the way a guillotine tilts a head. Kira quoted the camera footage with the confidence of someone who had already spun the verdict in her speech. "How could we ignore what is on the screen?" Kira asked, and Sophia, who had always believed in the sanctity of the family's reputation, inclined her head. "We must protect what is ours." Ksenia's exile lasted only enough time to organize the rumor into something public. The staff's whisper became a formal mention at the midday table. It was proper, sterile, and terrible for the simple reason that the household was a small world with narrow exits. To be accused within it was to be made into a story other people told at dinner. Gina thundered through the household like a storm when he heard. He was not someone known for carefully measured steps. He was someone who moved with a blunt force that could be helpful and reckless at the same time. He demanded to know how Ksenia could be treated like this. He asked questions that no one had thought to ask aloud. Where did the pendant come from originally? Who else had access to the nursery keys? What did it mean that one woman could be made into a villain overnight? Gina offered to pay what was necessary to make the situation go away. "Tell me what she needs," he said to Ksenia, in the dim corner of the pantry, where truth often made itself small. "I will pay it. Let me clear it. You don't deserve this." Ksenia looked at him and felt the burden of an almost kindness that carried its own penalties. She would owe him more than money if she accepted. She would carry a debt that could be traded into gossip. But the offer also had the bone of something she had not allowed herself in years. A man who saw her as a person to be saved rather than a tool to be judged. "Thank you," she said, because there was no room in her for another refusal. She put the money aside in the private ledger of her mind and told herself she would find another way. That evening, when the household sat to dinner, Kira's smile was a blade disguised as a spoon. She spoke of Prudence and the housekeeping ledger. Sophia nodded, lips pressed like seals. The family made a small show of sorrow and placed Ksenia's name by the side of things that could be tidied away with a staff reshuffling and a discreet farewell. Pavel retreated. He tried to keep the balance of family fairness, but the ledger of suspicion is heavy, and it bends even the most principled men into shapes of compromise. The thought that perhaps an internal betrayal could be the answer to a household's hidden anxieties was a soothing one to the house's order keepers. After all, people prefer a single villain to persistent chaos. Ksenia packed her things calmly, as though the packing were the performance of someone who had done nothing wrong. Her movements were precise, folding, wrapping, placing away, like a woman who had long lived by the dignity of small labors. Glafira clung to her until the child's small face was flush with tears and the confusion of being asked to accept an absence she could not comprehend. "Don't leave me," Glafira whispered, an accusation disguised as a plea. Ksenia held the child with both arms and pressed her forehead to a small, hot scalp. "I won't," she said, though the words felt like a lie in the way a promise can be when the world demands otherwise. Outside, the rain returned as if to wash the house of its sudden dirt. Inside, the household realigned. People took sides as if they were placing small coins on a board. Kira's victory was quiet but absolute. A name had been planted and taken root. Pavel stared at his hands like a man who had been put in a position to choose and could not yet see the horizon of that choice. In the attic, while she packed, Ksenia opened the old wardrobe and took out the scarf that smelled of petrol and rain. She pressed it to her face and for a moment let the past arrive in full force. 10 years ago, promises had been made in the dark, and she had kept them even when keeping them meant living so small she could hardly be seen. She had paid in ways that had nothing to do with money. Love had become a ledger where the lines were written in scars. A late knock on the kitchen door announced a visitor whose presence would complicate what had been arranged. Gina stood there, rain in his hair, and a determination that had always lived in his rib cage. He carried a package of bread in one hand and something folded in paper in the other. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "People like solutions. But the solution you're offering her, it's not fair. She takes everything. She gives everything. The house is ready to throw her away based on a camera angle." Ksenia looked at him and felt the weight of what he suggested. He had the offer again, but this time his voice carried an edge. Not just help, but an insistence that the household's actions be challenged. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Ask questions out loud," he said. "Make them answer. Don't let them tidy her away." Ksenia wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe in the possibility that someone would take her part and make the world right. But there was a cost to confrontation in a house built on reputations and savings. She saw it in Pavel's mouth when she thought of it. She thought of Glafira and the quiet, unromantic ways the child needed steadiness. Beds not moved, routines not interrupted, a school that did not ask for explanations. That night, alone in a small room borrowed until a final decision was made, Ksenia sat at the window and counted the houses across the street. Lights blinked in them like small answers to prayer. Her reflection in the glass was smudged into someone older than she had expected to be at 31. She pressed her palm to the pane and felt the coldness of the world. Pavel sat at his desk and watched footage again, because numbers and images permitted him distance. He rewound and watched the frame where Ksenia's hand might have touched the pendant. He watched the frames where she coaxed a frightened child to sleep. Each image told two different stories depending on who watched. He felt the weight of the household's need for an explanation press like a hand on his chest. He wanted to be fair. He wanted to be just. But justice is not always a single, clean thing. It runs on messy human choices. In the midst of that pile of decisions, something else moved the ground beneath his feet. He found himself thinking of Ksenia in ways that made him uncomfortable and strangely awake. He imagined her rising to greet the morning, hair haloed by sun. He imagined her voice reading a story in the nursery. He imagined her opening the attic closet and revealing the past she carried like a wound. He told himself these were observations that had nothing to do with the situation at hand. He told himself it was compassion, the impulse that made a father watch a stranger hold the thing he loved. But some nights, when the house slept and the numbers dimmed into the soft background of running water, he felt the edges of feeling sharpen into something else. It was in one of those nights, pale and fragile, that a quiet exchange changed the course of both of them. Pavel found himself walking to the borrowed room where Ksenia now slept. He told himself he would ask a question about the pendant. He would ask for calm. He would close a loop. But words died in his mouth when he saw her sitting by a small lamp, the child's drawings on the floor like flotsam, her hands working a small piece of thread in a way that looked like prayer. "Ksenia," he said, and the name was an anchor. She looked up, and the light made her eyes the color of green glass. The conversation that followed was the kind that unspooled from too much silence. "You could clear this yourself," she said, almost a reproach. "Tell them there's been a mistake." He shook his head. "It is not that simple." "It is simple when it is you who decides," she replied. People close ranks quickly. They forget the child. He inhaled and exhaled, the breath of small claws of surrender. "What do you want?" he asked, not as an instruction but as a question whose answer could reshape the house. "She needs someone to protect her from being moved like a piece on a board," Ksenia said. Her voice was not pleading. It held the calm of someone who had been awake to the cost of promises for a long time. Not just from being taken away, for that would kill her too. From being told the easiest solution is the one that hides inconvenient truths. Pavel looked at her, the governess who had always been the steady hand in the child's small storms, and felt the room around him narrow to the size of two people and one impossible possibility. He was the man who could move the child to safety with a signature. He was the man who could decide a woman's fate with a word. The scale of that power impressed upon him its ethics and its terror. For a suspended beat, time became a thin glass filament. Ksenia reached out with the timid bravery she had cultivated over years of being rewarded for being small and careful. Her fingers brushed his knuckle. The touch was an electric thing and also something tender. Not a claim, but a question, asked by the skin. He did not withdraw. He felt the smallness of her hand as a fragile truth. He felt his own fingers return the pressure in a way that sanctioned neither sin nor confession. It was simply a human echo. They both knew in that private moment the line they had approached. The world they inhabited had rules carved by legacies and money and the soft deaths of social realities. To cross it would be to reconfigure not only the household, but every safe and terrible thing tethered to it. Yet the warmth that had arrived in the room felt less like temptation and more like recognition. Two exhausted people who had been keeping vigil over the same small life and discovered in each other a kind of kinship that was not allowed a name. Neither of them spoke of love. They spoke instead of the child, of the account of duty, of the ledger of care and scars. The touch that passed between them was not a declaration. It was a mutual acknowledgement of risk. It planted a seed in ground that was already unstable. Kira, however, did not need seeds to grow. She had planned the harvest. The pendant in the nursery closet had been a key. Kira now pushed the lock. She curated witnesses, organized a small leak to the household circle of friends, and placed into the right ears the suspicion that sounded like betrayal. In the space between accusation and investigation, people began to fill in gaps for themselves. It is astonishing what the world will accept as truth when a tidy story is offered. When the formal meeting at which Ksenia would be asked to explain herself arrived, the atmosphere had the flavor of a tribunal. Sophia presided with a neutral air that felt like certainty. Other family members were there, their eyes sharp as knives. Ksenia arrived with her hands unclenched because she could not afford anything else. Pavel sat apart and watched, his jaw working, as if the scene were an accounting problem he could not solve. Kira presented the pendant with a flourish, and the camera footage in a sequence that made the images feel like a line of evidence rather than a lifeline. She spoke of trust and stewardship and the house's need for clarity. Her words were practiced. Her smile was a finality. "You know I have never been fond of public scenes," Pavel heard her say, "but there are things that cannot be left to rumor." Ksenia listened and felt the air compress. She could not scream or plead in a way that would change the course, and she knew that an angry defense would be read as churlish. So she did the only thing left to her. She told the truth, but truth in the face of a practiced fiction is a poor defense. The meeting ended with a compromise that pretended to be mercy. Ksenia would be placed on leave pending a full forensic review. She would not be permitted to be with the child until the matter was resolved. The household would preserve the child's routine, but would also safeguard the family's reputation. Glafira, when told that Ksenia would be absent for a time, sat on the nursery floor with a kind of incomprehension that made her small body tremble. Ksenia knelt and pressed her forehead to the child's and felt something break, something that would take the rest of their holds and twist them. "I will come back," she promised. Glafira's small face scrunched with the honest force of a child's logic. "Promise me you won't be gone like the tree," she said. Ksenia's answer remained the same. "I won't." The word felt increasingly like a lie as the house rearranged itself into a reality where promises could be moved like chess pieces. Night brought with it a storm of commotion, calls at odd hours, a lawyer's voice in the hallway. Gina pacing on the pavement outside the gate, as if the ground were not something he could control by sheer will. The accusation, once planted, had roots that preferred to claim more soil. At the far end of the house, Kira smiled into the quiet of her bedroom, pleased as a woman who had turned possibilities into profits. But even as she enjoyed the fruit of her work, there was a moment, unobserved, when a small doubt passed over her face. She told herself she had acted for the good of the family. She told herself that house and reputation deserved cleanliness. The comfort of this lie was enough to last the night. Ksenia sat on the edge of her borrowed bed and pulled the scarf she kept in her pocket, a thin talisman that smelled faintly of rain and the ghost of a life she could no longer call her own. She pressed it to her face and let the memory make room for the present. She thought of Pavel's hand, the brush of fingers that had felt like sin and salvation at the same time. She thought of Glafira's looking for faces in drawings and of Mikhail's desperation, which had set many of these events into motion, like dominoes, tipped by a child's unsteady hand. Outside, the rain subsided and the night grew cool. Inside the house, people turned pages of ancient scripts, the domestic kind, apologies made and refused, statements drafted with caution, anger sharpened where it would do the most damage. The house had always cared for appearances like a person clings to a sweater in cold weather. Tonight, that sweater had pulled tight enough to strangle. Before sleep could take her, Ksenia pressed her cheek to the window and watched the faint lights of the city. In the distance, a single shop sign buzzed with life. For a second she imagined herself crossing the street and walking toward a place that had nothing to do with names or obligations. She imagined being just someone who loved a child and had been accused of a poverty of heart. The thought warmed like a small, dangerous ember. The phone rang. It was Gina. His voice was a rush. "They're asking for you to sign something in the study. It says they'll move Glafira into a private facility for observation if the matter is not resolved." Ksenia's hand went cold. "No," she said, and the single syllable carried the force of a plea. "You have to come," Gina said. "You have to refuse them." "There's nothing I can do," she said, but the words were weaker than she intended. In the background she heard the house recompose its rhythm. Tea being poured, a curtain drawn, footsteps rehearsed into polite indifference. She rose, and for the first time in a long while, opened the attic wardrobe, sliding her fingers across old things, as if to find some secret the past might still offer. She found a small wooden box, and inside it, the photograph she'd lived by, a picture of two people smiling from a time before the rain. She held it until the glass warmed to her breath. Pavel sat alone and watched the house he managed to become the kind of story that people told in whispers. He felt the weight of the decision he had to make in a way that pressed the air from his lungs. The thought of the child being removed from the only place she recognized was unbearable. The thought of sheltering the household's reputation at the expense of a child's soul made the ledger intolerable. He stood and walked across the hall, the weight of a man who carries credit and blame, as if both were ledgers he could balance. In the dim, he reached for the phone and then hung up. He had not decided anything yet. He would need to choose, and choosing was the cruel part of stewardship. Outside the nursery window, a single paper bird on the mobile had tilted and stopped. Glafira's drawing lay on the windowsill, a house with two dark circles where faces should be. The pendulum of the household's fate hung in that fragile moment between accusation and justice, in the space where two exhausted people had touched and now had to weigh the cost of what that touch might mean. The next morning would bring questions, and with them pressure. People in suits would arrive with phrases polished like weapons. Mikhail would show up again, his face blunted with the kind of regret that arrives when Mikhail would show up again. His face blunted with the kind of regret that arrives when a man understands how many doors his choices have closed for everyone he loves. He came at noon, clothes damp from the rain that had only recently stopped. eyes rimmed with an exhaustion Ksenia knew too well. He did not try to invent excuses. He did not try to smooth the rough edges of his decisions into anything pretty. He was a young man who had traded futures for quick cash, and now he had come to trade truth for salvage. "They made me sell it," he said the moment the door closed behind him, and the house noise became a faint, institutional hum. "I thought Misha said he could get it back. He said he'd—" Ksenia held his gaze with the patient steadiness she always offered Glafira, and found that steadiness faltering when aimed at her brother. "Who is Misha?" she asked, because names make things more solid than they deserve to be. "A broker," he said. "Not a nice one. I was desperate." He pressed both hands into his pockets as if the cold could be tucked away. "I pawned things. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. I didn't think—" "You pawned the pendant?" she asked. The air between them tightened with anticipation like a wire. "I did. I needed the money. I thought if I could get it back no one would know. I took it to a shop 2 streets down that sells used things. I got 50. I thought, 50. Ksenia's voice softened, not because she had expected more, but because the figure made the scale of his desperation dreadfully clear. Mikhail nodded. "I gave the money away the night I promised it would be enough. I thought I'd pay it back. I didn't. Then the man, Misha, he said he could find the pendant for me. He called me 3 days later and said he had it, but he wanted proof I'd been the one who owned it. He told me to bring something or he'd keep it. He was saying things I didn't want to say no to. I was stupid. I thought if I asked Ksenia she would—" "Stop," she said, because if he kept explaining, he would drown himself in what-ifs, and she couldn't bear to comb through the wreckage of his intentions. "Where is the shop?" "Gone," he said. "Closed. But there's a ledger. The man kept records. Gina knows people who know people. I didn't go in myself because I couldn't face it." Gina's fist closed around his coffee cup so hard he left a crescent of white on the porcelain. He'd come with Mikhail, and his jaw had the hard set of someone who had been brawling with the world and lost, then decided to keep fighting. "We found a receipt," he said. "A paper trail. A pawn ticket with a number. The shop's CCTV shows someone selling a pendant that matches the description." "And?" Ksenia asked. "And the tape shows Kira in the street that day," Gina said, the words clipping. "Not the man who sold it. It shows her. She passes the shop on the way to the market. She stops. She looks in. Someone else moves faster. But then we tracked a receipt, and there's a number. Mikhail said he gave it to someone who promised to return it. The signature is Misha, but the call comes from a number Kira happened to give to a charity she runs. She used it to get a receipt back. It looked like a favor until she walked it into the nursery." Ksenia felt the floor tilt in a way that had nothing to do with dizziness, and more to do with the house's ability to rearrange its loyalties almost overnight. Proof felt like a small, bright thing, sharp and dangerous. Proof also had to be presented to people who had already rehearsed how to see her. "Why would Kira do that?" she asked aloud, the question more a plea than a demand. Gina's mouth was a line. "Because she once told me it would be better if the house was quieter for her plans," he said. "Because she believes in tidy things and thinks people should disappear if they make problems. Because she doesn't care about what gets hurt when she wins." Mikhail's confession and Gina's receipt set a new axis for the household. The discovery did not erase the weeks of gossip or the sharpness of the way people had looked at her. It did not repair the private humiliation of being escorted away from a child's bedside in the guise of an investigation. It did, however, give them something the house had lacked in the past days, the plausible grain of truth that could topple an artful lie. They took the evidence to Pavel first. Ksenia watched him listen with that particular painful restraint she had learned to read, an arithmetic of feelings where each reaction was measured before it could leak into action. He did not rise from his chair. He did not make the theatrical gestures Kira had cultivated. He sat and let the facts rearrange the room's geometry. The camera footage was clearer this time. Gina had been insistent. He'd gone back to the pawn shop, spoken with the clerk, bribed loose a few shards of detail. The tape showed a figure matching Kira's coat passing the front of the shop on 2 separate days, chatting on a phone line that pinged in the clerk's log. The ticket stub bore handwriting forged to look like sickness, an easy thing to replicate when someone had the patience. Pavel did what men of his station did when faced with the disintegration of an order they had upheld for years. He ran a slow, precise series of verifications. He asked questions in the way that asked less for truth than for clarity. "Could this have been a coincidence?" he asked. "It's not," Gina said. "Not if you follow the money and not if you look at the call logs." "Then we will follow the evidence," Pavel said. "We will do this properly. If Kira has lied, I will not let her turn this into the house's version of righteousness." That promise, when issued, felt to Ksenia like a small light, but light is a fragile ally in a house full of shadowed intentions. Kira, when confronted, did not at first lose her pallor. She had rehearsed composure long enough to wear it as armor. She smiled that practiced smile and spoke of appearances, of the need to maintain the household's dignity. "I only wanted to protect what is ours," she said. "If someone is using the child to hide mistakes, then we must act." When they played the clerk's testimony and matched it to the receipt and then the mobile ping, Kira's face faltered. It was not a confession so much as the slackening of someone who had been holding tension like a breath for too long. The household did not collapse in an instant. It unraveled with all the slow cruelty of long-hung suspicions easing their grip. People who had once nodded at Kira's practiced concerns now tilted their heads, watching to see which way the wind would turn. Sophia sat at the back of the small meeting and watched the proceedings with the clinical attention of someone for whom reputation had been a currency, used to buy life's small comforts. She folded and unfolded her hands, and then, when the final piece of paper, Mikhail's pawn ticket, hand-signed at last, was placed on the table, she exhaled like someone making space for a new order. "Kira," Pavel said at length, his voice the kind that had the effect of a bank teller counting losses. "Why?" Kira's reply was not a simple admission. She spoke of fear. Fear for the child's stability, fear of what would happen if a scandal were allowed to grow without a scapegoat. She spoke of practicalities, the household's debts, the reputational fragility that could close schools against Glafira, the way a whispered scandal might cost them everything. She did not use the word greed, but the calculus of advantage underwrote her motives. "I wanted to protect the family," she said finally, and there was no warmth in the sentence. "I thought, if someone had to take the blame, better that it be someone expendable." The phrase landed in the room like a blow. Ksenia's hands opened like dry flowers at the thought that she had been considered expendable. People who are made expendable rarely feel the right to rage. They feel only the cold pressure of injustice. Kira was dismissed from any household role that allowed access to the nursery or the accounts. Sophia insisted on a formal apology to Ksenia, a perfunctory ceremony of contrition staged in the drawing room for the sake of appearances. The apology tasted like thin tea. It did not unmake the weeks of accusation. But it did lift, at least, the formal barrier that had been erected between Ksenia and the child. When Ksenia returned to the nursery that afternoon, returned in the sense of being allowed rather than welcomed, Glafira's face unfurled like a map, making room for a place she had feared would be erased. The child's arms closed around Ksenia with a fierceness that was neither theatrical nor measured. It was pure, a small gravity. Ksenia let herself dissolve into it for a moment, and then, As the house drew its breath, she separated herself with the kind of restraint taught by long stewardship. Pavel watched them from the doorway, as if the sight could be counted and catalogued. The relief in the household did not settle into something soft or resolute. The air was taut with new problems. The way trust had been redistributed, the way debts had not disappeared because Kira had been removed, only revealed, and the way powers had shifted in a house where roles were seldom easy to return to their original orientation. "What happens now?" Glafira asked, with the bluntness only a child can sustain. Her voice was small, weary from the strain of watching adults make decisions that rearranged the floor beneath her. Ksenia crouched until their faces were the same size. "We will keep you here," she said. "We will keep the trees that grow in your stories, and we will keep the promises that are kept." Pavel's hand lifted in a hesitant gesture and rested on the back of a chair, as if it were a rudder he had not yet learned to steer. He stepped into the room and stood, not blocking the child's view, but close enough so that his shadow was long with the kind of presence he had always offered in measured doses. "She will not be moved without cause," he said aloud, and the phrase carried the gravity of a man who had filed papers and exercised control for decades. But even as he spoke, something else in his chest unfurled into a language that had little to do with ledger balances, a sense of possibility that terrified him because it was tied to tenderness. It was in the quiet hours after the storm of revelations that their forbidden truth found the contours of a conversation which had been avoided until now, because a truth admitted is a responsibility doubled. They met in the study, two figures drawn by faint lamplight. Ksenia had come because Glafira slept, and because there were questions she could not leave unanswered. Pavel had come because he could not live the way he'd been living, balanced on obligations that felt like thin planks. "You could reinstate everything," she said directly. "You could put it back as if the world were the same, but you know it's not." He turned a paperweight in his hand, an object that had once belonged to the child's mother. Its brass was worn. "I don't want to pretend I'm impartial," he said. "Not anymore." His voice was fractured in the way grief becomes when the task of ordering things finally expires. "I never left the nursery because I wanted to. I left because it was what I thought strength required. I was wrong. It made things worse." She considered him as if she were naming the attributes of a storm. "And us?" she asked, the two-syllable question carrying the weight of every rule that had kept them from being what they might be. He sat down across from her and folded his fingers on his knees. "We are complicated," he said. "We have to be honest about that, because whatever decision we make now will not only be about us. It will be about Glafira and the way a child's life bends to adult choices. I cannot be the man who both loves with a tenderness that might be dangerous and remains the final arbiter of consequence for a child who needs stability. That line is too easily crossed." She listened. She felt the fine spiderweb of possibility, forgiveness, union, continued secrecy, tremble in that silence. "What do you propose?" she asked, because the question made the conversation less like confession and more like a plan. He named things she had not believed a man like him would ever consider. He proposed legal changes, that he would resign from direct household control, sign over certain discretionary powers to a small committee including Sophia and an independent child psychologist, and most shockingly, that he would set up a trust for Glafira that guaranteed her care should anything happen that required her removal from the daily orbit of the household. He proposed removing himself from the household registry so that any future decisions about guardianship wouldn't be made by a man who might be compromised by affection. "I will not be the one making daily choices that affect her," he said. "If I stay in this house as the man of the ledger, everything we feel will be read as leverage. That cannot happen, not for her." Ksenia's breath hitched because the suggestion was both liberating and small in its cruelty. It meant safety for Glafira, But it also meant a division in their lives that would keep them separate, precisely to protect what they had come to mean to one another. It meant the house would survive, and that they would be forced to pay for their closeness with distance. "You could leave the city," she said, testing the sentence as if it were a brittle twig. "You could take the work abroad you always said needed travel. It would remove you from the reach of gossip." He considered the proposal. "And abandon my responsibilities?" he asked. "No, I will not vanish. But I can step back from public guardianship. I will keep my role as father in the private sense. Letters, visits that are planned, the kind of involvement that does not have the weight of everyday authority. I will remove the imbalance. I will make sure she is secure without me being the final public judge here. I will do it willingly." Ksenia thought of the ways power functioned, how an offered resignation could sometimes be the most powerful form of love. If he removed himself, he might be choosing a life of less visible comfort, but he would be protecting Glafira from the corrosive edge of their intimacy. It was not the romantic union a woman in a novel might crave. It was a sober bargain struck in the interests of an innocent heart. "And me?" she asked. "What would I be in this new arrangement?" He looked at her with the kind of intensity that was both terrifying and lucid. "You will be protected," he said. "You will be supported. I will formalize it. I will ensure that you are not in a position where you can be made into a scapegoat again. That means legal contracts, employment terms that cannot be revoked for private reasons, financial securities for the child's education, and if you want it, a path to be named her guardian in a formal capacity with the court's oversight." The suggestion toppled through her like a stone through water. To be named legal guardian would unmake the fundamental inequality of their relationship. She would no longer be an employee who could be dismissed. She would be recognized by law as the child's guardian. The trade, however, was staggering. For the father to surrender formal guardianship was to cut a part of himself away. "I can't ask that of you," she whispered, because the thought of a man handing over parental authority felt like plucking a limb from a tree. "You don't get to refuse a man who is willing to change his life," he said. "Not when the change is meant to keep what matters safe." They were two people facing a moral ledger that required both subtraction and addition. In the weeks that followed, they pursued legal counsel, arranged for a child psychologist named Dr. Anya to be part of the oversight, and drafted documents that redistributed decision-making power. Pavel signed forms relinquishing his primary day-to-day legal guardianship in favor of a structure where Ksenia's role would be formally recognized with legal safeguards. Professional oversight, fixed compensation, and a trust that would render the entire relationship beyond the reach of opportunistic gossip. The act was not simple. It required counsel, signatures, and a public statement that reoriented how the house would be perceived. When the family's lawyer explained the optics, Pavel accepted any scorn that might come. He understood he would be judged by those who believed a father must always hold visible power. He also knew that public power could become a weapon when paired with a private heart. Kira left the house not with a theatrical scene, but with her bags packed and a small, furious silence on her lips. She had been stripped of influence, and the way the household coalesced away from her plans made her both dangerous and diminished. She would have to make her own reckonings in other places. When all the papers were signed, the household breathed in a way that was not peace, but a different kind of order. The arrangement neither erased nor sanctioned the tenderness that had passed between Ksenia and Pavel. It simply made a new architecture for their lives that prioritized the child's steadiness. The forbidden love was acknowledged privately, brief touches, shared silences, a language of small concessions that kept each aware of boundaries. Yet it was not allowed to become the currency of daily decisions. For Ksenia, the formal recognition brought an odd relief and an unexpected loneliness. She had been granted a dignity that came wrapped in responsibility. She was no longer merely an invisible hand in the household machinery. She had to be both guardian and keeper. She would be the one to decide whether Glafira stayed in one school or another, whether therapies were intensified. She would be the woman who filed forms and sat at conferences. Love in this arrangement was not a path to romantic resolution. It became part of a careful strategy to keep a child whole. They never spoke the word that hung between them. No declarations, no promises that could later become liabilities. Instead, their confession was practical and humble. They formed a plan where Pavel's presence would be shaped by discretion. Visits at fixed, unpublicized times, a schedule of involvement agreed on with Dr. Anya, and a silent pact that neither would exploit the other via the channels that had once held such lethal potential. When the tabloids, because the world always finds gossip that suits it, ran a story that tried to conflate the legal changes with sensational details, Pavel accepted the damage without theatrics. He answered questions with economy. He refused to feed a hunger for drama. It was a painful lesson in the costs of doing the right thing in public view. Dignity can demand private ruin. Gina remained a steadfast presence, blunt in his affections, but wise in his loyalty. He helped Mikhail find steady work, brokering a place in a construction crew whose foreman had respect for a man trying to rebuild. He stayed in small ways, a kind of appointed uncle, the person who could take Glafira for ice cream and then hand her back while making sure she was safe and amused. His love for Ksenia became a softer thing, not the rescue he'd once imagined, but a sheltering patience that refused to demand what life could not, in good conscience, be asked to offer. Ksenia and Pavel's private moments took on the quality of minor liturgies. Late at night, when the nursery held only the soft rhythm of someone asleep, they would stand across from one another and let small kindnesses pass without consequence. Once, in a moment of such quiet, Pavel took Ksenia's hand and pressed the pad of his thumb to the scar she bore on her wrist, the small mark from the seatbelt years ago. He did not ask anything by the gesture. He only acknowledged what both of them already knew, that memory was an anchor and that anchors could both save and sink. "Thank you," she said once, the simple phrase carrying the weight of contracts and legalese and the unspoken tenderness that had not yet had the right to speak. It was not a declaration. It was a recognition. He did not say he loved her. He did not need to. He let his hand linger a heartbeat longer than necessary, and then withdraw, as a man who understood that restraint could be the truest form of respect for a child who had already learned how to lose. The household resumed its rhythms with a new, fragile coherence. Glafira's nightmares became less frequent under the patient regimen that Ksenia maintained and Dr. Anya endorsed. The mobile above the bed rotated with a steadier, less tremulous motion. The drawings on the closet door began to include faces again. First tentative circles penciled in, and then slowly shaded, small eyes learning to trust that they could be drawn into being. There was a moment months later that felt like a hinge. Glafira came home from a school trip with a paper she had folded into a bird. On it, she'd drawn a family in which 3 faces were filled in, not 2. She showed it to Ksenia in the kitchen, the paper bird held like a trophy. Ksenia saw in the child's work something she had not expected to see, a capacity for reconstruction. The child's face was untroubled by the legal architecture that had settled around her life. She only wanted purely someone to read her story. "Who are all the people?" Ksenia asked, because it mattered to know where the child's mind had placed the adults she had loved. "The mother," Glafira said, pointing to the first, "the one who is gone." She pointed to the second small circle. "And you?" And she hesitated, measuring the last with the instinctive logic of a child. "And a man who helps." Ksenia looked at Pavel, who had been near the doorway, and had come when Glafira called his name. There was no flamboyance in his movement. He crouched to the child's level, and for a fleeting second they were a small family in miniature, arranged by the simplicity of a child's art. The choice they had made, the one of legal reconfiguration, of private compromise, had not removed the ache of what could not be. It had, however, given Glafira a steadier ground. It had required each of them to make concessions that cut like honest knives. Pavel had given up the clarity of public fatherhood in favor of a quiet, contained involvement. Ksenia had taken on the burdens of formal responsibility that would never appear in the romantic endings of novels. Their love remained a luminous, dangerous thing, present in small touches, in shared glances across a table, and in the way they each interrupted their days for a child's need. Months folded into a year. The house sold a wing no one used and gave the profits to a trust named for Glafira. Kira left, rumor trailing her as if scent could account for sin. Sophia lived quietly at the edge of the property and spent her days playing with the child's hair and reading aloud the chapters of books she had always loved. In her way, she softened. Mikhail learned the discipline of wages and paychecks and slowly rebuilt some dignity. Gina opened a new restaurant and left a chair at the back for Ksenia. It was his way of being near without intruding. One evening, when the lights slanted in long, gilded strips across the wood floors, Ksenia went to the attic and opened the wardrobe she had kept shut for years. Her fingers brushed the scarf, the one that smelled of petrol and rain, and for an instant the weight of the past was as present as a living thing. She opened the little wooden box with the photograph inside. The faces in the picture were young, and for a moment she let the memory be the honest ache it had always been. Then she closed the box and set it back into the shadow, not to hide it, but to keep it where it wouldn't define every step she took. Pavel found her in the hallway as she replaced the box. He did not cross into the attic light. He stayed in the doorway as a man who knew how to be careful. "You are doing very well," he said, meaning more than the house's machinery or the child's testimony. He meant something about endurance. "And you," she said, "you kept your hands from fixing the world by force." He let the sentence settle. "We did what we could," he said. They stood like that for a long while, two people who had loved badly by the world's standards and wisely by the child's. There was in their shared space an intimacy that never called itself by name. It did not need to. The forbidden love that had existed between governess and patron had not been destroyed. It had been transmuted into something both more arduous and more honest. It would not be a romance performed in public. It would be a conduct of care that refused to use advantage as currency. That choice was not a triumph. It was a sacrifice of sorts. They had allowed the child's welfare to be the axis upon which their lives pivoted, and that pivot demanded distance as much as it demanded connection. The final unexpected turn came later that year, in a way few expected. The court recognized the trust and the oversight as a model for families where power imbalances threatened a child's welfare. It was not a sweeping legal precedent that solved injustice everywhere, but it did formalize a new approach in the small way that statutes sometimes do, as one house's answer to its own failures. When the press asked questions about the changes, Pavel issued a single line of statement. He would remain devoted to his daughter, but he recognized the need for structural safeguards. He refused to dramatize the private tenderness they had shared. The public did not know then the size or the nature of their affection. It never needed to. On the day Pavel left for a consulting contract abroad, something quiet that would keep him occupied and away from the daily optics of the house, he did not take a public carriage. He walked to the gate with a small suitcase and a less small sorrow. Ksenia stood beside him in the entrance hall, Glafira asleep in a room not far away, the house humming the sound of settled things. They did not make grand declarations. They did not enact a dramatic farewell. Instead, Pavel took both of Ksenia's hands in his own, and for a brief second held her as if he would be able to transfer all the gratitude and sorrow through the pressure of his palms. "For what it's worth," he said, and his voice was near broken by feeling he did not allow, "I would do it all again to keep her safe." She searched his face for a promise and found there instead a measured mercy. "I know," she replied, "and so would I." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, simple, respectful, and utterly private. The movement was not the consummation of a romance. It was the benediction of two people who had loved with the restraint that good sense demanded of them. Then he let her go. He walked down the garden path toward the gate, smaller by design now. A man who had chosen to trade some of his public authority for the quiet comfort of being a father in a more contained way. Ksenia watched him go until the gate closed and the road swallowed the last of his silhouette. She remained, not abandoned but appointed, guardian, keeper, woman who had been chosen by law to have a child's future under her hand. Glafira woke that night and asked for a story. Ksenia hummed as she always had and made up a new one on the spot. A tree that braces its branches against wind by closing its leaves. The child listened with the steady attention of someone who had learned to count the world in small talismans and family stories. In the drawer next to the bed, a paper bird lay folded and waiting, a little monument to what had been rebuilt by human hands. Years later, when Glafira could read the handwriting of adults and understand a sentence in its full import, she would keep that bird on the windowsill. It would be a thing that reminded her how people sometimes had to give up certain comforts for the sake of someone smaller. She would not need to know all the legalese or the sacrifices signed in quiet offices. She would only need to remember that she had been kept. The wardrobe in the attic remained closed most of the time. Ksenia opened it sometimes to rearrange the scarves and press a photograph to her palm, feeling the private architecture of memory like a pulse. The armario, the closet, had once been a place where the past hummed against the wood. Now it held, like any good chamber, the tools one needs to live. It became less a prison for memory and more a chest for things loved and not lost. In the end, the forbidden love that had never been meant to exist did exist, and its existence demanded a price. Love as confession would have been easy. Love as responsibility was bitter and exacting. They chose the latter, not because it made for a perfect story, but because it honored the one life that couldn't afford the experiments of adults. It was a choice neither wholly heroic nor wholly lamentable. It was human. On a late afternoon, when the light poured through the nursery window and made the dust in the air look like a galaxy, Glafira drew a new picture. This time, she shaded all the faces and filled the sky with many paper birds. She handed it to Ksenia and then to Pavel when he returned months later for a quiet visit. The three looked at it together in a stillness that counted as family. The last image, which would linger long in the house and in the hearts of those who had watched from near and far, was simple, the paper bird on the sill, catching the light. It was neither triumph nor tragedy. It was the proof of what careful, costly love looked like when the people who claimed it put a child's life first. If you felt something in this story, if the choice they made left you wondering whether love and duty can live in the same house, leave a comment and tell us what you think they should have done. If this tale stayed with you, subscribe and share with someone who likes stories that don't end simply